Cast your mind back to the autumn of 1949. America is booming. The war is over, the factories are humming, and Detroit is putting out some of the most flamboyant automobiles this world had ever seen. A 1949 Ford Custom, with its smooth, flush new body. A 1949 Chevrolet Styleline. Long hoods, wide grills, chrome everywhere cars that made a statement just sitting in the driveway. The average American wasn't just buying transportation, he was buying an expression of post-war optimism on four wheels. Now into that market comes a tiny British car, barely 13 feet long from stem to stern, powered by a 1,247 cubic centimeter side valve engine producing 38 horsepower. A car that looks, as one famous American road tester colorfully put it, like a slab-sided tobacco can. A car that takes just over 26 seconds to reach 50 miles per hour, not 60, mind you, 50. And this car had been deliberately named after one of the most sacred symbols in American history, the Mayflower. That is the story we are telling today. The Triumph Mayflower, a car that was christened for the ship that carried the Pilgrim Fathers to Plymouth Rock in 1620, designed specifically with American buyers in mind, imported and sold in this country by a New York dealership, and then almost completely ignored by the very people it was built to charm. Out of approximately 34,000 Mayflowers built between 1950 and 1953, barely 510 found buyers in the United States. So what went wrong? Was it the styling, the performance, the price, or was it simply a case of a British car company fundamentally misunderstanding what America wanted in the early 1950s? The answer, as we will see, is all of the above, and then some. Sit back, because this is one of the most instructive case studies in the history of the automotive export business. Section 1. Export or die, the desperate gamble behind the Mayflower. To understand the Mayflower, you have to understand the world that produced it. Post-war Britain in 1949 was still in the grip of austerity. Petrol was rationed until 1950. Consumer goods were scarce. The British government had one overriding economic priority: earn dollars. The phrase, export or die, was not a slogan, it was national policy. The government directed the car industry to push a significant proportion of production overseas and, more specifically, to target the United States, because American dollars were the currency the nation desperately needed to rebuild. Into this environment stepped Sir John Black, the hard-driving managing director of the Standard Motor Company, which had acquired the bankrupt Triumph brand back in 1944. Sir John was an ambitious, competitive man. He had watched Jaguar, another Coventry company, begin its assault on the American sports car market, and he wanted a piece of it. But his ambitions went further than sports cars. He wanted Standard Triumph to offer a full range of vehicles that would appeal to British buyers at home and to discerning buyers abroad. Sir John had a theory that luxurious no longer had to mean large. He believed that the American market, particularly those buyers who admired the craftsmanship of British coachwork, would pay a premium for a small car that projected the elegance and formality of a Rolls-Royce or Bentley, but at a fraction of the price. And the name he chose for this car was no accident: Mayflower, the ship of the Pilgrim Fathers, the symbol of the bond between Britain and the New World. Even the bonnet badge was designed with an engraved image of the sailing ship, a direct and deliberate reference to that shared history. Sir John was not a subtle man. The Mayflower was unveiled on the 28th of September, 1949, on the very first day of the Earl's Court Motor Show in London. The press reception was genuinely enthusiastic. By any measure, it was a striking, unusual little car. But here is where the first problem appeared. Deliveries did not actually begin until the middle of 1950. That 6 to 8 month gap between announcement and availability cost the car some of its early momentum, and by the time it crossed the Atlantic, America had moved on. Section 2. The Razor Edge, a design that divided opinion. Let us talk about how this car looked, because that was the thing that made the Mayflower either fascinating or ridiculous, depending on your point of view. The body was designed by Leslie Moore, chief body designer at Mullins of Birmingham, with input from Walter Belgrove, the chief stylist at Standard Triumph. What they created was a miniature version of the Triumph Renown's razor-edge style, the same architectural, sharply creased formal look that had been fashionable in British coach-built cars since the mid-1930s, when firms like Freestone and Webb had first applied it to Bentley and Rolls-Royce chassis. The razor-edge look was exactly what the name implies: hard, crisp, almost architectural creases where most cars had gentle curves, no swooping fenders, no flowing rear haunches. The facade, just clean, upright, squared-off formality. It worked beautifully on a large car on the full-sized Renown. For instance, it conveyed genuine dignity. On a 13-foot, two-door economy car, the effect was different. The vintage Triumph Register put it diplomatically when they noted that it has long been open to question whether the knife-edge style worked on such a short wheelbase. Others were less generous. James May, the motoring journalist and television presenter, once named it the ugliest car ever made. American road tester Tom McCahill, writing in Mechanics Illustrated in December 1952, described its angles as being more acute than you can find in the uplift ads, which gives you a flavor of the man's writing style, if nothing else. Yet there was genuine engineering cleverness buried in that odd shape. The upright, space-efficient design actually gave the Mayflower a surprisingly roomy interior for a car of its dimensions. 4 adults could fit inside. There was decent headroom, especially up front. The body shells were built by Fisher and Ludlow at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham, the same facility that would later produce Austin Healey bodies, using what was, importantly, unitary construction. The Mayflower was the very first car produced by either Standard or Triumph to use a monocoque body without a separate chassis. For 1950, that was a genuinely modern engineering choice. There was also a convertible Barely. 10 drophead coupes were built by Mulliners in 1950, with a view to adding an open model to the range, but the project was judged financially unviable and cancelled. None of those 10 cars are known to survive. The body shells were painted in 2-tone combinations. The chrome was applied generously to the radiator grille and bumpers, and leather seating was standard. For a car of its size, it was genuinely well appointed. The problem was not what was inside it. The problem was what was under the bonnet. Section 3. The engine that wasn't up to the job. Pull up the bonnet of a Triumph Mayflower, and you find a 1,247 cubic centimeter, 4-cylinder, side valve engine producing 38 brake horsepower at 4,200 revolutions per minute. The torque figure was 58.5 foot-pounds. Now, before you dismiss that engine entirely, understand its context. The side valve layout, sometimes called flathead, was not unusual in British economy cars of the early 1950s. The engine itself derived from the pre-war standard Flying 10 unit, updated with an aluminium cylinder head and a single Solex downdraft carburetor for a modest increase in output. It was mated to a 3-speed, column-shift gearbox, borrowed from the larger standard Vanguard, with synchromesh on all forward ratios. The front suspension used coil springs and telescopic dampers, an independent arrangement that was actually quite advanced for the car's class and price. That same front suspension design was later adapted, with modifications, for the Triumph TR2. The brake horsepower, however, was moving a car that weighed approximately 2,100 pounds. And that combination produced performance figures that were, even by the standards of 1950, genuinely unimpressive. When the motor tested a Mayflower at Brooklands in 1950, they recorded a top speed of 62.9 miles per hour. 0 to 50 miles per hour took 26.6 seconds. Fuel consumption came out at 28.3 miles per imperial gallon. Those figures were not wrong. They were simply honest. Tom McCahill's American test in December 1952 yielded a 0 to 60 time of 26.3 seconds, and a top speed he estimated between 65 and 70 miles per hour. He was characteristically generous. For context, The rival Hillman Minx of the same period took an interminable 40 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour. The Austin A40 needed 29.4 seconds. So in the company of its British competitors, the Mayflower was not outrageously slow, but those were British competitors. In America, a buyer shopping in the same price bracket could sit behind the wheel of a vehicle with a 156 cubic inch straight six or a 239 cubic inch flathead V8 and drive away with confidence. McCahill, ever the quotable character, found things to admire. He praised what he called the exceptionally fine handling and described the steering as light and sure. Cornering, he wrote, meant the car held on like a tar stain on a white shirt. That was a compliment from McCahill, but even he could not pretend the performance was anything other than modest. He called it no bolt of lightning and left it at that. Section 4, The American Market. 510 sales. Here is where the story gets genuinely painful, at least from Sir John Black's perspective. The Mayflower's US MSRP was set at $1,750. Now, hold that number in mind and consider what else an American buyer could choose at that price in 1951. A basic two-door Chevrolet Styline cost $1,629. For that $121 difference, you got a six-cylinder engine producing 100 horsepower, a car that could seat 6 people, automatic transmission as an option, and the full weight of General Motors' dealer network behind it. If you wanted something even smaller and were drawn to the import market, a Ford Anglia, which was roughly comparable in size and engineering to the Mayflower, could be had for $948. The Mayflower cost nearly 80% more than that. The U.S. cars were imported officially by Fergus Motors of New York City, a respected importer of European vehicles that also handled Morgan and Alvis. Their showrooms were legitimate, their operation professional. The cars they sold were left-hand drive U.S. specification Mayflowers, identifiable today by a serially numbered Fergus Motors identification plate attached to the firewall near the commission number. If you ever encounter a Mayflower in the United States, check the firewall. That Fergus plate is a piece of automotive history in its own right. But Fergus Motors could not conjure buyers out of thin air. The car that arrived too late, Triumph, had missed the brief post-war window when American buyers were so hungry for any new automobile that they would consider almost anything, and it arrived too early for the compact car. Revolution that would sweep through America at the end of the decade. When the Volkswagen Beetle was finding its audience and the Austin Healey Sprite was winning new admirers, the Mayflower was already gone. It was, as the vintage Triumph Register noted with some sadness, too early for the compact, small import car craze of the late 1950s. In North America, 510 Mayflowers were sold. Some sources round the figure down to approximately 500. Either way, that is catastrophic for a car that Sir John Black had genuinely believed would open a new chapter in transatlantic trade for Standard Triumph. Graham Robson and Richard Langworth, in their book Triumph Cars, The Complete Story, captured the mood perfectly, writing of McCahill's description of the Mayflower as a slab-sided tobacco can, a geranium pot, a turnip. They noted that those who were sympathetic to the little car nicknamed it the Watch Charm Rolls, while others called it many worse things. Sir John Black, they observed, doted on the little dear. It was, they concluded, not a sentiment shared by the American public. Section 5, Production Numbers, the UK Market, and the Commonwealth. The Mayflower did not fare brilliantly at home in Britain either, though it did far better there than in America. Total production ran from the first car off the line on the 30th of June, 1950, to the final example completed in July, 1953, a bare 3 years of actual production. The grand total was approximately 34,000 to 35,000 cars, depending on which source you consult. Of those, 16,395 were sold in the United Kingdom. The remaining 17,605 went to export markets. The majority of those export cars went not to America, but to Commonwealth countries Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and others. In these markets, the Mayflower's formality and relative build quality made it more appealing than it was on the vast American highways. Australia produced its own variation of the Mayflower story. Standard Triumph's Port Melbourne plant in Victoria assembled 150 coupe, utility variants, essentially a Mayflower, with a flatbed rear built from knockdown kits imported from Britain, fitted with locally fabricated load bodies of timber. They are an extraordinary footnote in the car's history, and a number still survive in Australia. Back home in Britain, Triumph had announced the Mayflower's replacement in February 1952, even before production had ended. The car that succeeded it was the Standard 8 of 1953, a car that was about as far from the Mayflower's pretensions as it was possible to get. Where the Mayflower had aimed at aspirational buyers, the Standard 8 was a stripped-down economy car with an 8-100 cubic centimeter engine. Sir John Black's vision of luxury in miniature was abandoned entirely, and Sir John himself did not survive to manage the transition. He left Standard Triumph in 1953 under circumstances that were not entirely of his own, choosing the same year the Mayflower ended production. The three models that had embodied his vision, the Roadster, the Renown, and the Mayflower, were all discontinued without direct successors. From the ending of Mayflower production in 1953, there would be no small saloon carrying the Triumph name in the United Kingdom until the launch of the Triumph Herald in 1959, a full 6 years later. One final technical footnote worth mentioning: the Mayflower's front suspension design was not wasted. It was used on the Triumph 20 TS prototype, and in modified form it found its way into one of the most successful British sports cars of the era, the Triumph TR2. So even a commercial disappointment can leave its mark on automotive history. Section 6. Where are they now? Of the approximately 34,000 to 35,000 Triumph Mayflowers built, some sources estimate that as few as 100 examples survive worldwide. That makes them exceptionally rare, genuinely rarer, by sheer numbers, than many cars considered desirable collectibles. And yet rarity, in the case of the Mayflower, has not translated into high values. The market for these cars has always been modest. A well-restored example sold at RM auctions at Monterey back in 2010 for $13,200, respectable, but hardly remarkable. US dealer, Hyman, Limited, in Street. Louis has offered restored US specification Fergus Motors cars in the $30,000 to $40,000 range, which reflects the premium attached to properly restored, left-hand drive American market examples with documented provenance. In Britain and Australia, where the cars are somewhat less exotic, prices tend to be lower. The Triumph Mayflower Club, which maintains an active membership and an invaluable historical archive, provides the best resource for anyone seeking a Mayflower today or trying to identify and restore one. Parts availability is reportedly manageable, as the mechanicals are shared with the Standard Vanguard and other standard products that were made in far greater numbers. The Mayflower even has a small claim to cultural distinction. Australian painter John Brack used the car as the central subject of his 1953 work, simply titled The Car, a significant piece in Australian modernist art. Not many cars of 34,000 production units can claim a place in a national gallery. The Triumph Mayflower stands as one of the most fascinating failures in the history of the British motor industry, not because it was badly made, but because it was so precisely wrong for the moment and the market it had been designed to conquer. Sir John Black's logic was not unreasonable. A small car with formal coach-built styling, genuine leather seats, and the prestige of the Triumph name sold in America under the most evocative brand name a British car company could possibly choose, ought to have found some sort of audience. And perhaps, had it arrived 5 years later, when American buyers had begun to tire of the excess and seek out the honest craftsmanship of European imports, it might have done better. The Volkswagen Beetle would prove there was a market. The Mini would prove it again. The Mayflower was simply ahead of that particular curve. What we are left with today is a car of genuine curiosity, formally dressed, stubbornly British, utterly at odds with the chrome-laden, tail-finned excess of the era that surrounded it. Tom McCahill eventually admitted, in that same Mechanics Illustrated review, something that his opening fireworks obscured. The Mayflower was, quote, growing on me. Even he could not quite dismiss it. Those 510 Americans who bought one through Fergus Motors of New York City knew something their fellow countrymen did not. They were buying one of the strangest, most singular automobiles that the post-war world produced, a car that named itself after an act of historical bravery and then politely refused to hurry. Now, we would love to hear from you. Did any of you ever ride in one of these as a child? See one in a neighbor's driveway? Perhaps you own one of those extraordinarily rare survivors. Tell us your story in the comments. The history of cars like the Mayflower lives in the memories of the people who were there. If you found this video useful, please give it a like. It genuinely helps us reach more people who share this passion. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is a good moment to do that. We have a great many more stories to tell, and we would be glad to have you along for all of them. Thank you, sincerely, for watching. You are exactly the kind of audience that makes this worth doing.